for actually coming. Got it. Share screen. Oh, shoot. What happened to my, I got to go back into this. There we go. Okay, can you all see that map of the North Atlantic?
Finley, it's not shared at the moment.
Escape. What did I do? There.
Yeah.
How about that?
That's
okay.
Perfect.
So awesome. You see, now I'm gonna go to, what's that look like?
That looks perfect, Finley. Thank you.
Good. Well, you never know, all this technology that's so good, you'd think it would work every time seamlessly. And this basically has. It's just the idiot trying to operate that slowed it up a little bit. But anyway, really great. And I really appreciate the fact that all of you are here, as I say, especially those who are not friends and family, because you didn't know what you were getting into. And this is about a 45-minute presentation. There's a lot of slides. It's going to cover a tremendous amount of geography. It's going to go quickly across the Atlantic on this green line, not spending much time on that. It's going to start to really go on the cruise to Spitsbergen, come back across the Atlantic through Iceland, around Greenland, up this west coast, over to Baffin, up to Labrador, up Hudson Strait, and then back down to St. John's in Newfoundland. And I think we just get going quickly on that. Because there's so much material, I'm going to follow my notes pretty closely, which may have me at times feel like and sound like to you that I'm reading, and I hope that that can be tolerable because it will get us through quicker. So there's something in human nature that allows us to leap into the unknown like this, prepared as best we can, perhaps, but still just plunging in where most wouldn't dare. My personal inspiration came from a book written by a Philadelphia guy called Newbold Smith about his extraordinary voyage racing to Bermuda in 1976, I believe, and then from there going north to Iceland, across to Norway, up to Spitsbergen, back down to Greenland, over to Labrador, down the Labrador coast to Newfoundland, and then from there straight on down to Chesapeake again, all in one summer. And what you're looking at tonight is going to be essentially that voyage taking place in 14 years. To do this trip, I needed a good boat, and for whatever reason, I'm a wood boat guy, and I found this Elskop, a 46-foot sloop, designed by Augie Nielsen and built by Wallstedt in Denmark in 1969, and cared for to a fairly well by the Noyes and Smith family in Marblehead, so that when I got her in 1998, she was essentially a new boat. And this is basically the way we went to sea. My friend Ed Hazard, who's since passed on, dropped this in my pocket as I went out to get on the boat and go across the Atlantic. Finley refused to relent. A sea voyage was his intent. He simply was frantic to cross the Atlantic, so he bought a good boat and he went. The transatlantic was essentially an uneventful 21-day sail, mostly a nice reach and prevailing southwesterlies, some calms, occasionally easterly when we were overtaken by a low, lots of fog on the Grand Banks south of Newfoundland. But interestingly, at that time, after the fishing moratorium, there were no boats out there, which was good because we couldn't see anything anyway. But there was, the one constant was motion. going on deck every evening for a nice cup of tea after dinner, I never failed to spill it. And once across, we cruised the English Channel and then up into, we returned the boat to where she was built at Walstead's. And then the next summer went into the Baltic Sea. And then in 2002, on up the Norwegian coast to Tromsø. And this is the city of Tromsø in North Norway, 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle. You can see that the weather and the climate over there, I should say, is considerably more gentle than what we would have at the same latitude on this side of the Atlantic. Tromsø is a very interesting city. Lots of museums there on the north and the Arctic, and Roald Amundsen and so forth. There's also a university there which has a particular expertise in linguistics, and the Norwegian beer is, which for some reason I forget the name of, but that's brewed there. Water stays above freezing, and thanks to an arm of the North Atlantic Current. I left the boat in the water there over 2 winters and flew over in both cases in the spring to see what sort of damage might have happened, and the result was really nothing. She was in a place protected from the wind. As I say, the sea didn't freeze, and so the boat did well, except for her varnish, which was a real mess and has never really recovered from that. Svalbard represents the highest latitude that one can achieve on a yacht anywhere on Earth. Svalbard is right here, and you can see that everything else is pretty much frozen. Elsewhere in the Arctic, 80 degrees latitude is covered in sea ice. In the Antarctic, what isn't dry land is ice itself, is ice shelf. And unlike the rest of the Arctic, there's no native population in Svalbard. There's the Greenlandic population, the Inuit in Canada, and the Sami and so forth in Siberia and northern Lapland. Whaling, fishing, and trapping brought the original settlers to Spitsbergen. Coal brought a permanent settlement at Longyearbyen in the 1900s, the early 1900s. Coal is also mined at the settlement at Barentsburg, the Russian settlement. The coal being a carboniferous, a derivative rather of carboniferous plant life, how could there be coal this far north? And the answer seems to lie in the theory of continental drift. Svalbard at one time, according to this theory, was much closer to the equator, and another theory attributes it to the Earth being generally warmer in former epochs. This is science that I don't know a whole lot about, but it makes some sense when you read about it. This was the trip in 2003 from Tromsø up to the far north of Spitsbergen, to the point where there was nothing but nothing north of us but water, and all land was south of us. Or we like to think that, even though over here in Greenland, the land is a little bit higher. And this was our landfall in Hornsund in the south, and image of the life at sea on the way up there. And these are the kind of views that we found once we were in place. So we came into Hornsund, as mentioned. Belsund is here. The big thing in Belsund, which actually wasn't there when we were there, is the Norwegian Global Seed Storage facility, where they're essentially putting all the seeds that they can get hold of for all the horticulture in the world into this vault. And over time, they hope to build it. It's about a third full now. They hope to build it, obviously, to more. From there, we went up into Barentsburg, which is the Russian coal mining town, Longyearbyen, the main settlement, explored Pyramiden, which was another coal mining place that was closed down a couple of years before we got there. And then on up to Neolison, which is a global research facility researching Arctic material and so forth. Magdalena Fjord is sort of the Valhalla beauty spot. And then the furthest north we got was into Raud Fjord. We were kind of stopped by the ice right around in here, so we're unable to do the circumnavigation I had hoped for. This is my idea of the anti-Newport, the anti-Edgartown. It's no place for a yacht. This is the Russian community of Barentsburg, typical old rusted equipment, old rusted buildings, old coal lying around in mud and dust, and but a very gay and friendly population there. This fellow in particular had taken my crew off, which I was pretty annoyed by it, actually. And so they came back after an all-nighter. As I was getting up and making myself some breakfast, he brought me back some of whatever they had been drinking all night. This is the community of Longyearbyen, which is a far cry from Barentsburg in terms of modernity and facility and tourists and all that. Typical Scandinavian community. People seem to come up there, spend about 2 years, and then go back. So there isn't a real permanent population, but there is a year-round population of about 2,500. In the early 1990s, when I was, the early 1990s, summer visitors and tourists numbered about 20,000 or so. By 2017, it's reported there were 150,000 overnight guests, a figure that doesn't include the 300 or so cruise ships that now go up there all the time. The year we were there, the numbers were about 1,400 for a population in Longyearbyen, and 40,000 for tourists, which seemed like a lot. And so it is with all the places I visited. I'm glad I got there when I did. I think it would feel a lot more touristy now. To visit Svalbard by private yacht, one must get permission from the local sysselman or governor, and this involves establishing credentials, having a plan for one's cruise, and most onerously paying in advance for search and rescue, either by an insurance policy or a letter of credit or a cash bond. And I was able actually to arrange something with Brown Brothers through my local savings bank here in Hopkinton, Massachusetts. So that took care of that one. And finally, one is required to be armed when ashore away from Longyearbyen to meet. That's because there are polar bears all over the place and people are constantly encountering them. Although we really didn't particularly, but there have been these incidents. So it's a requirement that once you leave the city, the town, you carry a rifle that can deal with a bear. And to meet that requirement, I rented one in Tromsø from a sporting goods shop. But I also took some shooting lessons here in Hopkinton, just have some sense of what I was doing. And those don't need to be shot, but they were fun to see on the way up, heading up the coast toward Neolison. This is the research station I mentioned. And an additional special permit is required to visit Virgohamn, which is where the Swedish balloonist Andre attempted to fly over the North Pole and ended up coming to grief short of that. And then there was an American called Wellman from New York that tried to do the same thing in a dirigible. And in the course of their efforts, they, of course, brought a lot of equipment to Virgohamn and they left it there, which all looks like kind of a dump. And so there I was standing looking at all this stuff, and down came a helicopter with the very woman from the sysselman's office who had given me the permit to be there. So that was a lucky thing. And then two fellows with cameras and clipboards jumped out and started photographing all this junk and making sure essentially that it stays in place, that nothing was missing and nothing had been moved. It's cold up there. The water's full of ice. The temperature varies with the amount of ice from sort of the low 30s where there is ice in the water to 40s. The air temperature, I should say, varies with the amount of ice from the low 30s to the low 40s. We had the full complement of weather in July and August 2003 when we were there. It was fog and drizzle. It was brilliant sun. There was no wind, and there was a lot of wind, but there wasn't any snow. And we did see one polar bear. And that was a little bit of humor. Then back down at the end of 2003, we ended up back overwintering for 2003 and 4 back in Tromsø, tied up to a pontoon and a lonely marina with all the other boats had been removed. And in 2004, returned back across the Atlantic from Lofoten to Iceland to southern Greenland. And then ultimately we went across to Labrador. But for purposes of this show, we're going to turn the corner at Cape Farewell and go up the Greenland coast. Lofoten Islands are just these incredible high peaks that go straight out of the sea, tiny villages, snug harbors. There's a winter cod fishery, or what they call stockfish, which are fish for when the sun starts to come back in February, and then hung out to dry, salted and put on these racks. So that's a big part of life up there at that time of year. And then later in the season, whaling begins. This is one of the few places in the world where whaling is still accepted. They have a permit system which allows them to take as many as 670 minke whales. They argue that there are something like 87,000 whales in the sea, so they don't think that the world would miss 670. In the years since we were there, the catch has dropped further to around 450 annually. But this is what a Norwegian whaling boat looks like. And there's a cannon that shoots out a harpoon up in the bow. And we saw them actually fire that off and get one. This is what a Norwegian whaling skipper looks like. And this is what a piece of Norwegian whale meat looks like, which we took aboard and cooked up a little of. And it doesn't taste at all fishy. It's much more like a buffalo or a caribou or something of that nature, a good wild meat. And then over to Iceland. And my idea, and the reason for going from so far north, Lofoten Islands are here, over to Iceland. This is the pilot chart for the North Atlantic in July. And my idea was that there are these lows that just go one after another across to basically bumping into Norway at Bergen. And to be on top of that, we would be in this kind of a wind circulation. And the wind arrows on the pilot chart bear that out once you get over closer to Iceland. The reality is for us, we motored halfway over. We were basically in a calm weather the whole way. And then we got a nice northerly for the last day or so to sail into Iceland. And it's a very typical landfall view. Iceland, the mid-Atlantic ridge runs basically northeast to southwest across Iceland. You have Europe on the right and North America on the left. This is what the fault looks like, and this is a tourist spot, just a little bit north of Reykjavik, called Thingvellir. And those of you who've been to Iceland would recognize it. It was I wouldn't, it was kind of a politically, civically sacred place where all men and women from Iceland would meet together in the early days of the settlement there, sort of in the 12th century. And these are the places that we visited. We made the landfall at Husavik, went into Akureyri, which is up a 35-mile fjord, and consequently has a little bit more temperate weather. And then in the northwest horn of Iceland, Ísafjörður was our stepping off place to go to Greenland. And this is the most exciting place. You remember Newbold Smith's book was called Down Denmark Strait, and Denmark Strait has a nasty reputation for gales and general unpleasantness. But we were very lucky. Our crossing to Greenland was a nice sail with east and southeast breezes and mist and fog. But there were whales everywhere. And there were blues, fins, humpbacks, orcas, blowheads. We think we saw all of these, but we had a great fun trying to argue with each other as to which one was which. They all look kind of black and finny, but humpbacks have a nice white patch on them, and the orca's got this great sail that sticks up, so you can't miss that. And the blue whale is absolutely enormous. The approach to Greenland was wonderfully dramatic. Clearing air at about 10 o'clock in the evening revealed a Grand Teton kind of viewscape as far as the eye can see, both north and south. We felt there that we were privy to a view that really only a handful of humans in the history of the world have ever seen. By handful is, I'm talking about several million probably, but there are only people who are up there whaling and fishing. So there's the run-of-the-mill tourists like us. Unfortunately, we found solid ice out to 40 miles offshore. This is a iceberg. This is freshwater ice breaking off from a glacier up north and coming down on the current. The sea ice is this low stuff, which was impenetrable, at least as far as I was concerned. And finding this out to 40 miles, I had really hoped that we would be able to get in and explore the anchorages there and see some of this scenery close up. But it was also kind of a relief that we couldn't get in there because there are essentially no charts on this coast, and the anchorages would be essentially discovered at best. So not getting too close saved us from a potential shipwreck. Unlike that of the cruise ship Ocean Explorer last week, which ran aground up north of Scoresby, which is a place 20 years ago you couldn't go. I mean, it just was the ice was never out of there. So it's just very interesting to hear about that. We were also frustrated for not being able to get a close-up view and from not discovering all those potential safe harbors, but ultimately from not getting to transit Prince Christiansund at the southern tip of the island. We did encounter the expedition ship in that season called Lubov Orlova off Cape Farewell. She reportedly is ice strengthened, but not enough to attempt to go into Prince Christiansund. I called up the skipper because I was sort of hoping that he might be going in and he would go slow enough so that we could follow in his wake and he would have created some open water for us. But again, I was probably lucky that temptation was not available to us. But interestingly, the Lubov Orlova's owners fell on hard times some years later. And by 2012, the ship was stripped for salvage. An attempt was made to tow her to the Dominican Republic for scrap, but that was in the winter of 2013, and she broke loose from her tow in that cruise and was left adrift in the North Atlantic. It's unconfirmed, but presumably she sank. We spent 48 hours working our way down that coast, 40 miles off it, and tacking into the ice pack and then off, and finally hove to overnight because it was now getting dark down here. And we've just sort of bobbed back and forth. And then woke up we finally got around the corner here, woke up the next morning to fog and bright sun directly overhead. And find our way into Nanortalik. It turned out it was also a marvelous day for seal hunting and among the icebergs. And all of a sudden, as we were coming in, we were suddenly aware of gunshots and small boat motor noises all around us. And we made our way through the ice and the rocks and the sun overhead, fog and water, into a bloody scene in the harbor. They didn't really like us taking these photographs, but took them anyway. The Greenlanders, as all of the communities in the north, are constantly dealing with the Greenpeace environmentalists who are trying to stop the whale hunting and stop seal hunting and so forth. So there's a bit of tension there. But we also made friends, and we made friends with the adults too. But these guys were marvelous, and they went to the store with us, and they carried all our groceries back. And so that was a fun one. The West Greenland West Greenland is suburban countryside in comparison to East Greenland. It truly is a green landscape, just no trees. This is where most of the population of 55,000 total souls in Greenland live, 15,000 in the capital city of Nuuk, and the rest in a dozen other communities spaced south to north, up as far as Etah and the Kane Basin. I know some of you have been over there, and when we get to questions and answers, you may have some opinions about this that I'm not aware of. This is the city of Nuuk, the capital city, still pretty far in the south. This is the kind of housing that's there, and it's the main port of entry. An important phenomenon in the mid-coast is Disco Bay, and this is the Ilulissat Ice Fjord, which is the biggest tourist attraction in Greenland. It's a huge river of ice descending from the overall ice cap and calves off enormous bergs, which ultimately break up into smaller bergs and flow north toward Baffin Bay before circling south on the Baffin and Labrador currents until they break up and melt off Newfoundland, where they can be a significant threat to shipping, not to mention small yachts. And this is, it's irresistible to take a photograph and look at the weather. It's totally calm, beautiful blue sky. So we put a couple of people out in a small rubber boat and then motored around to the other side of this. Didn't go through for obvious reasons. Had them take the picture, and then we came back and picked them up. North of Disco is Uummannaq Fjord, which was our farthest north on the west coast. This area was home of the American artist Rockwell Kent for a year or so in the middle of the last century. He originally sailed there on a small cutter Direction and wrote this marvelous book, North by East. And one of the things I've just really liked about his imagery of Greenland is it's so reminiscent of what we saw when we were there. The light's obviously different in this situation, but it's just very familiar. And then this is the town of Uummannaq, and you can see the housing here is more individual than those big things in Nuuk. From Disco Bay north, one's overwhelming senses of dog manure and barking dogs. The prime means of winter travel is dog sled over sea ice. That's actually getting to be much more of a problem now as the sea ice is coming later and melting earlier, which traps residents in, like Uummannaq is an island. So that without being able to get on the sea ice, it's somewhat problematical. But there aren't any dogs and dog sleds south of Disco Bay because the sea just plain doesn't freeze there. The language is Danish and Greenlandic with very little English. It's not much of a problem. There's enough language for taking care of food and fuel, but one wishes for a better way to take in the cultural experience. So in other words, we were able to buy a fish from this guy, which was prepared by Darren and Ed, but we really couldn't have much of a conversation with him, which I kind of regretted. So leaving Umanak Fjord and heading over to Baffin Island, we were intending to make a landfall at Cape Dyer. We had a wonderful sail across in fresh breeze and gray seas, and arrived to a gloomy, cloud-shrouded Cape Dyer looming darkly ahead with bits of remaining sea ice, only that week having retreated north of the Cape. In other words, it would have been too much ice for us to even make a landfall there, still posing a bit of a threat to the unwatchful. But the wind died overnight, and Hor Bay, we were coming down this way. Hor Bay presented itself as ripe for exploration in such conditions. So in we went. And you can see that the Baffin charts are really rudimentary, particularly when you get close to the sea. It's the same thing in East Greenland. The only soundings are really for entry into harbors serving the old dew line station. So you get maybe a line of soundings like this going up in here. I don't think this is the dew line station, but for some reason they had that line anyway. And we did manage to find a few, we just sort of slowly went along in, and we were able to kind of go along, and we found a really snug little anchorage in here. Would have been a great place to spend the night, but we kept going, and we went around, looked at this, went in here, and actually had a look at this little basin. But there's so much, it was quite a tidal rush coming out of there, and I was afraid that we would get stuck or something. So we chickened out and didn't go into that, and ended up spending the night up in here. And then further down at Loxland and right off the Hall Peninsula, which is down in here, we found another anchorage, which was good because we got in there at low tide, and finding our way in through all the rocks and breakers and so forth, we could see what we were doing. It was lucky that we had gone in that way, because when we went out the next day, it was high tide, and all of that stuff had disappeared. You all know how that works just in Maine. So the view is, sorry, lost my place. The view in Baffin is really rock on rock, gray on black, and occasional white rock, some bigger than others. And some of those this, by the way, was that basin I was trying to get into, but the tide was running through here just too hard. Some of those white rocks, quite a few of them actually, turned out to be polar bears. And I just have loved these shots. And it's a good way to leave Baffin and start talking about Hudson Strait. If few sailors get themselves to Svalbard, Iceland, Greenland, almost no yachts bother to go to Hudson Strait. Hudson Strait is like all straits. It's a connector. And by the way, Hudson Strait is spelled with an apostrophe S, which was pointed out to me by John Boxtos, who's a stickler for details like that. And so I've really tried to be very careful that it's Hudson's Strait. It's the connector between much larger bodies of water through which tidal variables adjust themselves, with at times exciting implications for small vessels susceptible to large tidal ranges and strong currents. But unlike other straits, there is very little there from a commerce point of view, and it's frozen over from November to July each year. Even more so than Northwest Passage, which is up in here. But here, Fury and Hecla Strait, which would be another way to go through, is that's impassable for all but really a short period in September. It was a route of considerable interest for a short time in the late 16th and early 17th centuries amongst Northern Europeans looking for a northwest passage to Asia. And the reason the Northern Europeans were looking for it is that the Southern Europeans, the Spaniards and the Portuguese, were pretty much had control of the Southern Ocean. So it was that Martin Frobisher, John Davis, Henry Hudson, Thomas Button, William Baffin all made numerous voyages to the region and gave their names to places in and around the strait. 400 years later, not much has changed. Davis's furious overfalls are still there out in here. The fog is still there. The land and the sea is pretty much as empty as a hand of man as it ever was. And the tides are somewhere between 25 and 30 feet all the way through here. But there is indeed a human presence. The Inuit and their Aboriginal predecessors represent small but established populations going back 2,000 years and more. What were encampments during seasonal hunting migrations of earlier days have become established communities in the modern era, especially now with the native land corporations having been established. New infrastructures in place, new jobs have been created to run new bureaucracies. The co-op stores have replaced the Hudson's Bay Company, and daily commercial airplane flights run to and from southern urban centers. So it's all quite accessible. But getting close to a jetty to take on fuel or water has got to be done at high tide. And so you get to time your moves. We were anchored out here in somewhere around 50 feet of water at high tide, which dropped down in the 20s at low tide. And we came on up in here, and a truck came down and gave us water, and another truck came down and gave us fuel. And that all worked out pretty well, but you just had to be very careful, it'd be gone. And we had a homestay in Kimmerat with Jeannie and Elijah Padlock. This is Elijah. He was going to take us. Elijah spoke no English. Jeannie had a little bit. But it was a great thing. I'd set it up in advance because we were going to do a crew change up there. And I wasn't a bit sure that we would be able to hit the schedule I had coming up the Labrador coast to get here. So that we wanted to have a place the fellows that were coming in could stay. And it turned out worked out beautifully because it was freezing cold when they got there in their short pants from Cape Cod. So they had a chance to be in a home and adjust. And we got a chance to get off the boat and have a shower and do some laundry and get a lesson in making bannock, which is the wonderful water and flour, fried up water and flour mixture that is basically the sustenance of the world over and different names, but there it's bannock. And then because of that relationship, 2 days later, we got up to Cape Dorset, and we were met there by Jimmy Manning, who was Jeannie Padlock's brother, and his really lovely family. He just took us in, took care of us. His granddaughter did a wonderful portrait of Elskov, which she got from looking over here. We had them out for dinner the last night we were there, and but it was just a marvelous opportunity to meet the people and get some of the cultural experience. And the cultural experience in Cape Dorset, which by the way is now referred to as Kingayet, is based largely on art and carvings and paintings and drawings, which were really stimulated by this fellow James Houston, who was up there in the 50s and 60s. And some of you know the Houston North Art Gallery in Lunenburg, and that was, I believe, his sister or his mother, I'm not sure. But and this is the kind of work that's available for purchase and is sent down to the southern galleries. These are the people that are doing it, and this new co-op building, which has been built since we were there, gives them a really great opportunity to send their culture south. It still doesn't mean that life is easy up there. It's a cold, gritty place, and it's amazing how these people manage to eke out a living there successfully and keep that culture going and growing. Just more of what Baffin looks like. This is Charles Island down on the north shore, the Nunavik shore. Baffin itself is Nunavut. This is the Quebec side, which is Nunavik. Very hard to find any greenery, but you have to look closely. And you can see there's still a lot of life. A red-throated loon, and unfortunately, we chased her off her nest by mistake, but presumably she got back to it. And there's one of our crew going off looking for a place to relieve himself around a tree. But it's not all that barren. There's these kind of scenes on the Nunavik shore as well, which really quite pretty in their own way. This was Cape Hope's Advance, which was our stepping off place to cross Ungava Bay to go over to North Labrador. This is a place where you just hang on by your fingernails. There's no decent anchorage there, but we had arranged a crew change, so that meant we had to spend a day kind of figuring out what we were going to do to stay out of the wind. We'd spent the night off the village of Waktok. That worked okay, but the next morning the wind came up blowing right in on us. So we had to move. Waktok is up over this ridge. And we spent most of the day south of there, but by the time we picked up the crew change, the wind had shifted around, so we couldn't go back down where we had been in a lee, and we came up around Cape Hopes and got behind that, and we were able to find enough, but it was bouncing around all night. And then the next day, we spent a 24-hour period going across Ungava Bay. Cape Hope's Advance is this finger that sticks up. And I just very interested to see Akpatak Island. It's one of these sort of Valhalla places like Alaska is for Americans and Greenland is for Danes. Nobody lives out there, but there's a sort of a rite of passage for all these. There are a lot of little communities all the way around Ungava Bay, and the men and the young men go out in the spring before the ice is gone to hunt walrus. Walrus are a very dangerous animal in that environment, and the ice is a dangerous place, so it's quite an exciting adventure for those who go. And arriving on the other side of Ungava Bay, we went through the skinny little McClellan Strait at the top of Labrador. This narrow slit of water sees a 26-foot tidal difference between Ungava Bay and Labrador Sea twice a day, which means you've got to await slack water for making the passage. Then once we're through, we're going south along the Labrador coast. We're in the Torngat Mountains National Park. This is another piece of water that comes in 15 miles from the sea. There's no charted depth in here, but whatever, we just went in and we've gotten quite cocky about finding our way around at this point, for better or worse. And then into Saglek Fjord, which is one of the beauty spots of the Labrador coast. And there is a summer headquarters for the Torngat National Park, Torngat Mountains National Park here. Torngat Mountains is everything north of Hamilton Inlet is essentially run by the Inuit through this territory is called by its Inuit name, Nunatsiavut, and that the government that controls Nunatsiavut takes care of things like health and education and the kinds of things that one deals with in one's local community. The provincial government takes care of things like policing with the RCMP and the Mounties and so forth. And obviously the federal government takes care of the Coast Guard and the border issues. And then a little bit of a view of the Labrador coast. And then we get down to Nain, which is really in mid-coast Labrador, upper mid-coast. Nain is the farthest north community in Labrador. Lots of energy here, lots of winners and losers in terms of population. At the time we were there we were there in 2006, 2008, and by there in 2013. So we've been there quite a bit. But in 2006, there were reported to be 1,100 residents. And by August, 700 of those had been arrested by the Mounties, they told me. So there's a lot of activity there. It's a rugged coast north of Hamilton Inlet, but becomes quite lush and beautiful south of there, with many interesting abandoned fishing communities to visit. This is not an abandoned fishing community. This is an abandoned whaling operation in Hawk Harbor, which burned to the ground, except for the metal parts, in 1959. But it had been active starting in 1905 by 3 different operations, and reportedly processed as many as 5,500 whales. Donald McMillan went in here with Bowden in one of his trips right after the war in the 40s. And you can find at the main Steam, Sail, and Power Museum website, you can find a video of his visit to Hawk Harbor when it was operational, and it's just fascinating to see that. I think there's a lot of other words you could use to describe it as well. And then our last stop in Labrador is Battle Harbor, which is really fun to visit. It's a restored, essentially a buying station, buying and supplying all the fishermen on the Newfie coast of Labrador. So it's just basically what you call a company store, I guess. But it's kind of, it's scenic, it's nostalgic, I've been in there, I guess, 3 times and just really enjoyed that process. There are tourists there, and they tend to be, because it's hard to get to, they tend to be interesting as well, not your run-of-the-mill tourists. More Battle Harbor. And then the last 2 places I'm going to talk about are Funk Island and St. John's. Funk Island was the last outpost of the now extinct great auk. Great auk were hunted by fishermen from northeast coast of Newfoundland, take the feathers and send them to New York for the millinery business down there to put into ladies' hats. It's extraordinary bird island still, though. There's a cloud of gray mist over the island as we approached, and it turned out that it wasn't a gray mist at all. It was a cloud of birds. The little puffins and mures represented the busy commuters and delivery men, these little guys. And then the gannets, the white gannets soaring in majestically from higher altitudes like transatlantic SSTs, supersonic transports. And not unlike humans, these birds were not about to intermingle as a species. The black ones settled in one spot, the white in another. No longer possible to land here due to government restrictions, but it would be very tricky anyway, due to the sheer difficulty of hopping onto a rock like that in the open sea surge. And finally, St. John's, Newfoundland, always an interesting harbor. The Russian trawlers and old cable layers from my first visits in the late 80s have changed now to service vessels for offshore drilling industry. Thanks to oil, Newfoundland's on the verge of, or has now become, a sending province in terms of revenue provision to the rest of Canada. But the once great fishery is a shadow of its former self. The city retains its charming historic older sections along the harbor and the battery and this along in here. And the drama of entering from the sea through the high narrows remains exciting, especially in fog or at night or both. So that's the cruise. It's just a few general thoughts. And these are basically bullet points. A varnished yacht is an exotic visitor in the North. I found that people don't know quite what to make of one. Something a little more trawlerish might be a better fit. We found we spent about half of all these voyages motoring, which makes me think I'd just as soon have a well-found motor sailor with a big, slow-turning prop to make these voyages, a vessel that's easily driven, and one that affords some warmth and protection from the weather. But we did find an Elskov, and I loved that boat. It treated us so well. The world runs on diesel fuel, so anywhere one finds civilization, refueling is possible. Lots of my friends with yachts always worry about the quality of the fuel, but dirty fuel is just as bad for this guy as it is for me, so I was never particularly worried about it. The challenge comes when one is completely away from civilization, i.e. the east coast of Baffin. We went 1,000 miles in 2 weeks from Umanak, way up in Greenland, to Nain in mid-Labrador, between fuel fill-ups. It's important to pay attention to the consumption and plan for needs. The Arctic is not seen as quite the attraction that the Antarctic is, which has always surprised me. Yet the scenery is certainly as exotic. There is some same midnight sun in summer, and there is ice in the water. There are no penguins on one hand, but there are polar bears, and there aren't any of those in the south. Plus, it's a lot nearer. Nonetheless, it's a big deal to go there by yacht. It feels somehow heroic, which I suppose is compensation for the fact that it's slow and expensive travel. Often accounts of voyages to exotic realms like this involve hair-raising adventures caused by bad luck or mistakes. For the most part, we were lucky and avoided those. In fact, the exoticness is easy to overlook when you are there. The phrase that Gary and I like to use, wherever you go, there you are, seems to sum it up. All these places are just places, albeit remote and hard to get to places. The fact remains, however, that all of it feels a lot like a stunt. To go to these remote corners is risky. Managing a small yacht in a remote wilderness is not something that I do all the time. It's only been a few days at a few times in a few seasons, and it could be naivete is all that allowed us to go and get back safely. On the other hand, we did try to plan for the conditions we would encounter. We tried to keep the boat and equipment simple. We made sure it all worked. We sailed conservatively. We ate well. We paid attention to our morale. And ultimately, we were all, those of us who went, were intensely interested to be where we were. And that is that. And I know there are a few of you like Dean and Gary and Walter who've been on these, and Charlie has been to all across the southern Newfoundland coast with me. So I just, I've been so grateful for the fact that you've been willing to come with me on these trips, and I hope that this has been a little bit interesting to you. Thank you.
Finley, the only word I have right now is spectacular. So thank you. That was outstanding. Yeah, simply outstanding. We did save some questions for the end, and I just want to encourage folks to put questions in the chat box if you have them, or take yourself off mute. But I am really curious, Finley, just how did you assemble your crew, and how did you find those adventurous souls that would say yes to joining you on all of this?
Well, that's a really good question, and they're much better friends. I'm looking at Gary, Walter, Dean, Charlie, my brother Tom, Paul Bishoyev, my wife. Trish, she spent a week in a motel with Gary, which got to be pretty exciting. Trying to get to Nain. So anyway, yeah, even Nadia came with me for a while once. Yeah, so it's just been, I don't know, they can tell you better why they're willing to go, but I think people are adventurous. It's a wonderful opportunity. I've made some terrific friendships doing this.
Absolutely. So Finley, you shared with us a lot of amazing wildlife sightings, but did you have any that were outstanding, or were any of them your favorite moments?
Those polar bears in Baffin, I mean, that's just the luck we got in getting such clean. So many of the bears you see are kind of yellow and hungry looking, and those bears look like they were in great shape. And so that was really exciting to do that. And we were so lucky with the weather that particular day. It was just, that was in Hor Bay. It was just dead calm, so we could just sit there and watch them as long as we wanted to. And it feels very safe in that circumstance because they were just curious to see what we were, and we were curious to see them. So we looked at each other quite a while.
Totally.
Can we ask questions, Alicia?
You sure can, Bobby.
Finley, I was just curious about, did you ever anticipate, what did you encounter that you never anticipated?
I don't think there was much of anything other than, just, I think I was scared to death to go to Hudson Strait. I really thought that was going to be wild. And it ended up being the combination of the particular crew that went up there that year was very strong. So that took a lot of my worry away. And then the people we met and the way they approached life there was also very calming. And then we had good weather. So we were able to do whatever we wanted to do. And, we just, you make some judgments. And one of the things that happened on that particular cruise, we left Cape Dorset and went out to, one of the islands out there. It was about a 20-mile sail, and we had 25 knots over the transom with the sails up, and we were bearing down on this gap coming into there was a place where you could come in north of the island, but inside some offlying islands. And I had asked the guy at Cape Dorset, "Do you think we can go in there?" And he says, "Oh yeah, that's no problem. We go in there all the time." But there was no charting for that, and my plotter showed that we were a good 300 yards off where we wanted to be. On the other hand, the radar was dead on and showed us exactly where the opening was. So we felt quite confident in that. And then Paul Bishoyev was on here. He had a DeLorme handset that he used, and he said, "Well, let me look at my map." And his map was right on the money. So we felt between the radar and Paul's map that the plotter was screwed up, and the hell with that. And we went flying in there. And as soon as we did that, the fog lifted, and we were just there on a lovely hot afternoon. So you never know things. You've done plenty of that stuff yourself, Bobby. So.
Oh, dear.
Finley, why do you suppose there was never any human habitation at Svalbard?
Well, it's small, and I don't know why. I mean, there were some Pomar people from Russia who went up there, but mostly they were hunters. And I think the reality is that the islands are just too small to really support a population that anybody would have bothered to make their way out there. But I don't know. I'm not an anthropologist. I think someone who looks at northern anthropology could do better, and Knut Rasmussen or somebody of that nature. He was the one, by the way, that figured out that the Inuit had started as a population over in Alaska. And where they came from to get there, I don't know. But his ideas that the Greenlanders had all come from over there. Some of you may know a lot more about this than I do, but one of the things we tried to do was to learn as much as we could about where we were. And obviously you can't learn it all, and we didn't come close. But Newbold Smith, by contrast, was a man who really just wanted to move the boat. And I'm not sure he ever, I don't want to cut him short because he was way more of a sailor than I am, but he just tore around on his boat. I'm not sure how much of the interaction he actually had, but he was something.
Finley, what were the biggest perils that you faced in this incredible expedition?
I don't really recall a peril that we, hadn't been prepared for.
Yeah. Did you ever go aground?
No. And the idea is you want to come back. And somebody says, "How was your trip?" Uneventful is the word you want to use.
I had to break in here on that. To your previous question, Bobby, and the whole thing is Finley is one of the top best planners for trips like this and preparers, so that if something looks like it's going to go wrong, he's ready for it, but he's prepared the boat and the crew beforehand, and this would be backed up by the other people who have been with him, I'm sure, to the nth degree of being prepared and running a very, very good boat. I just feel privileged that I had a chance to accompany him for some of that.
The only time we ever hit bottom, Walter, you were with me when we had that centerboard down there in Labrador and just bumped over.
Yeah,
Actually,
that's something I used to do a lot in Muscongas Bay when we were racing. And could crank it up like that.
Walter,
also,
I will second that about being prepared. Finley spent an incredible amount of time figuring out where we're going to go, how we're going to get there, what we needed to take. We prepared for anything. And the other thing is, for me, Finley had the courage to go there, and I couldn't find a better person to follow through all these passages. But for me, the highlights were the interactions with the Inuit and the different populations, and the camaraderie, and the fact that I never felt unsafe. I always felt safe, and maybe we were lucky, but I think it was because good leadership, good boat, and a lot of preparation, and a great crew.
Here.
Finley, there's a question about what kind of instruments you carried on board.
Oh, that's interesting. When I got that boat in 1998, and when we went across the Atlantic, I had there was a Loran set on it, so we had that, but that was pretty defunct by those days. I also had one of these little Garmin, not Garmin, Furuno GPS sets. That's what we used going across the Atlantic. And then as time went on, I had a radar. As time went on, we got a plotter, and I had a single sideband, which I never learned how to use very well. I had Paul was actually good with that going across the Atlantic. We had Herb Hilgenberg on every night for 2 or 3 hours. That was fun. And and then going on the trip up to Hudson Strait again, I was worried about that, so I put a second radar on that, and but nothing particularly fancy. I did use for getting weather and communicating with the outside world. I had a sat phone and eventually kept 2 of those on board and found that much more effective. It was obviously more expensive than a single sideband, but I could count on it, and I could get different kinds of weather. I was always able to get at least 2 different kinds of weather. And I could get them by either by radio or by over the sat phone, essentially an email operation. And that was very helpful. We could really figure out pretty much what, some people like to sort of second guess the weather, and I don't think I'm smart enough to do that. So I always kind of take what they give me. And as long as we had 2 different reports that agreed, we did pretty well with that.
Folks have any other questions for Finley?
This is Charlie in Delft. What happened to the boat since then? Where is the boat now?
What's happened to the boat?
Yeah.
Yeah, I sold it in 2018 to Matt Murphy, who is the editor of Wooden Boat magazine. So she's right there in Brooklyn or in Matt's home port of Castine. And he's got her for sale now at 3 times what he paid me for her. So we'll see how that goes.
Well, what a delight. Thank you, Finley. Fabulous send off for us. Thank you so
Well,
much.
You're very kind for all the attention you've given, and really appreciate the people who are not friends and family who showed up here. That says a lot about the Carpenter's Boat Shop. And the friends and family, I hope you will get interested in Carpenter's Boat Shop as it goes along. Great organization. Thanks very much, Alicia. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome, Finley. A true pleasure. Thank you all for being here this evening. I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you.
Bye, Finley. See you soon.
Thanks.
Bye, Walter. Scary.
Thank you. Great presentation.
Thanks, Finn.